were nothing but NPCs to them. The line dropped like a verdict, cruel and casual. Silence followed, the kind that makes a room feel colder. On the counter sat a cinnamon roll, untouched, its sweetness gone stiff with time. A hand reached toward it, then stopped, trembling as if the weight of the words had frozen it in place. This wasn't food. It was betrayal disguised in sugar and dough, a reminder that something once alive had died here long ago. The man across from the plate did not flinch. His face revealed nothing yet. His stillness spoke louder than outrage. He wasn't here for a meal. He wasn't here to pass through. He was the one who had built this place. And now, hidden in plain sight, he was watching it crumble. The diner announced itself with a groan. The old sign above the door swayed in the evening wind, each hinge crying out like something tired of holding on. Paint peeled in strips, curling down like brittle skin. The letters that once shouted with pride had thinned to whispers, half erased by time and neglect. The sky pressed low, heavy with dusk. Shadows stretched long across the lot, pulling color out of the world. The windows reflected only gray light, dull and indifferent. Inside, dust drifted in slow circles, catching what little glow remained, turning the air into a haze of forgotten days. Every corner felt stripped of welcome. What had once been bright now looked like an imitation of itself, hollowed and lifeless. The sign creaked again, as if it wanted to speak the truth aloud. This was no longer the place it promised to be. Memory struck with the force of contrast. The line once reached out the door, people waiting with easy patience, laughter spilling into the street. Families leaned on each other, the air warm with anticipation. The door would open, and the smell of cinnamon wrapped itself around every guest. Sweet, sharp, inviting a scent that seemed to say, "You belong here." Plates clattered with joy, not rush, and conversation rose like a chorus. At the center of it stood a woman. Her smile was not decoration, but conviction. A roll, she used to say, should greet a person the way a home does. Her words clung to the walls, stitched into every table, into every bite. Those days were golden, untouched by fear or fatigue. A world where sweetness was more than taste, where hospitality was more than habit. That world now lived only in fragments of memory sharp enough to wound. The floor no longer shined. Its checkered tiles dulled under years of footsteps that stopped coming. Chairs stood in silence, pushed back from tables with nothing to offer. A cup lingered at the counter, stained with old rings of coffee-brown marks etched into porcelain like scars. No one bothered to scrub them away. The mark had become the truth. A server drifted past, not walking, but floating, every step automatic. Her face carried no light, only the endurance of someone pushing through another endless shift. She moved as if invisible, as if her presence mattered no more than the dust she left behind. The warmth was gone. The room held only a chill, not from air, but from absence. It was not neglect that weighed heaviest, but the betrayal of knowing what had once been. Every surface whispered of something that used to matter, now reduced to nothing. Harlan's gaze returned to the pastry before him. The cinnamon roll sat lifeless, a shape without spirit, yet it pulled him backward through years he had tried to bury. Memory did not arrive politely. It surged. He saw her again, her smile, her hands dusted with flour, the way she leaned across the counter to test each batch. Her words had been constant, more command than suggestion. A roll must taste like home. She had meant it. Every swirl of dough, every streak of icing was her offering of comfort to strangers. A stranger should walk in and feel less alone. That was her gospel, and he had built an empire around it. Now, confronted with this cold imitation, he pressed a breath deep into his chest, stifling the sound before it escaped. His shoulders held the silence, heavy, private. The ache remained sharp enough to cut, but too quiet to share. The roll did not soften under his stare. Its glaze cracked like brittle skin, its warmth long vanished. A dead thing masquerading as sweetness. Harlan lifted his eyes, searching the room for signs of life. None met him. Not one face offered a smile, not one glance held welcome. The air was transactional, stripped of grace. Workers moved by, wrote their steps rehearsed into fatigue. Customers hunched in their corners, eating without savor, waiting only to leave. This was not the house his wife had built. It was a husk wearing her name. The betrayal was not in the food alone. It was in the absence of care, in the hollow eyes of those who should have carried her dream forward. A place once warm had turned indifferent, and indifference was the cruelest violence of all. He saw it clearly. The roll symbolized not tradition, but its desecration. A figure emerged from behind the counter steps, dragging as though the floor itself resisted her weight. Her uniform clung in wrinkled defeat, a badge of exhaustion rather than pride. The name tag at her chest was scratched nearly blank, its letters fighting to be remembered. Her face told more than words. Hollow cheeks, framed eyes darkened by nights too long and mornings too early. She carried fatigue the way others carried handbags, inseparable, constant. Yet, when she reached his table, she tried lifting the corners of her mouth into a smile that betrayed itself at once. It cracked brittle, the kind of smile born not of joy but of obligation. Harlan saw her for what she was, not just a server, but the embodiment of everything his creation had demanded and devoured. The weariness in her body was not laziness, it was sacrifice, and it was written all over her. Elena had lasted 3 years here, though each one looked carved into her face. 3 years of standing behind the counter until her legs trembled. 3 years of nights that bled into morning shifts stretching past midnight while the town slept. Her eyes carried the proof, dark rings etched deep, refusing to fade. Her hands bore the rest, roughened by endless dishes, swollen by the weight of trays. She spoke of it lightly, as if it were nothing more than routine. Yet the cracks showed. She described the double shifts, the tips cut short the constant surveillance of a manager who measured worth in minutes lost. She said it with a weary shrug, but the weariness betrayed her. Still she smiled. Not with joy, not with hope, but with the grim persistence of someone who cannot afford to break. The smile was armor stretched thin, hiding the fracture lines that everyone else pretended not to see. She told him then about her son. A boy waiting at home, hungry more often than not, staring into an empty lunchbox with the patience only children can hold. She promised him each morning, "I'll bring something back tonight." Sometimes it was a roll, sometimes nothing at all. But the promise never faltered. Her voice caught when she said it, soft and breaking in places. The words wavered between pride and defeat. A mother's will to protect clashed with the reality that stripped her bare. Harlan listened in silence. He did not interrupt, did not pretend to comfort. His eyes settled on the untouched pastry before him as if it carried all the weight of her confession. He felt the sting not in her words alone, but in the quiet courage behind them. Her suffering had a name, a face, a child waiting at a kitchen table. The bell at the door stirred, and an older man entered, one of the few who still came. He ordered a roll, the kind he had eaten here for years. When the plate arrived, he studied it, long lips pressed tight. His eyes dimmed with recognition, not of flavor, but of its absence. He pushed the plate back untouched. His voice dropped low, almost apologetic. "It isn't the same." He left a few bills for coffee rows from the booth and walked out without looking back. The silence he left behind was heavier than his presence. Elena stood near the counter, tray in hand, fingers trembling though she forced them still. Her eyes followed him to the door, but her face did not move. Harlan saw it all. The loss was not in revenue or reputation alone. It was the loss of memory, of loyalty built over decades. A customer had walked out, but what truly left was trust. Elena kept trying. Her lips pulled upward as if routine could mask the weight pressing her down. But the smile betrayed itself, almost instantly collapsing under its own effort. It was not joy, not even politeness, it was a broken gesture, a trace of something that once meant warmth but no longer held life. Harlan studied it the way one studies ruins. He saw the fissures etched into her face, the exhaustion bleeding through every forced expression. What should have been welcome now resembled a shadow of happiness, hollow and unconvincing. The diner's silence only sharpened it. The smile floated in a room that no longer believed in kindness, suspended like a ghost that could not let go. It was not an act of charm, but of survival, the smallest shield she had left. And to Harlan it revealed more truth than words ever could even hope here had worn itself to death. Harlan let his eyes wander across the room. Empty tables sat like abandoned islands, their surfaces wiped clean of meaning. The pastry on his plate sagged in place, its sweetness drained, its promise betrayed. Then Elena's hands caught his attention. They trembled slightly as she set down cups, the motion stiff, practiced, yet unsteady. In her effort to remain composed, she was already unraveling. All of it fused together, the deserted chairs, the lifeless food, the servants shaking hands, forming a single reflection. It was not just decline, but collapse staring back at him. He did not speak. He did not move. But inside, recognition tore through him. The empire he had built was no longer standing. It had cracked beyond repair. What he witnessed now was not mismanagement alone, it was disintegration, plain and merciless. The silence around him was not emptiness. It was prophecy. The kitchen doors burst open, and with them entered a presence that changed the air. Dawson stepped out short but thick-set, his bulk carrying more menace than strength. His shirt bore stains of grease and neglect clinging damp to his chest. His hair shone with oil combed flat, unnatural, his eyes hard and unfeeling. He scanned the room with the arrogance of ownership, though he owned nothing. His gaze sliced through staff like a blade, leaving each of them smaller than before. When he spoke, his voice cracked against the walls, sharp and deliberate, each syllable an attack. Conversation died instantly. No one dared raise their head. Even the sound of silverware softened as though afraid to be heard. Harlan watched him in silence, jaw tightening. The contrast was unbearable. The man who once promised dignity for every worker now confronted with a petty tyrant ruling over ruins. And everyone, including him, had to endure it for the moment. Dawson's fury cracked across the diner without warning. His eyes locked onto the youngest worker, a boy no older than 18, carrying a tray still marked by grease. One corner, unpolished, a streak of grime catching the light. Dawson seized it as proof of incompetence. The shout tore out of him, rough and cutting, every syllable designed to wound. The words ricocheted off the walls, stinging sharper than any slap. The boy shrank, head bent low as if trying to fold into himself. His hands trembled, clutching the tray too tightly, knuckles whitening under pressure. Around him, no one intervened. They stood in silence, eyes averted. Elena stiffened, shoulders curling inward as if the roar had struck her too. The sound lingered like a whip across skin, each echo heavier than the last. It was not a lesson. It was humiliation, deliberate, public, and merciless. Dawson's power thrived not in correction, but in fear, and everyone in the room absorbed it. When the shouting ended, nothing filled the space. The diner sank into a silence more oppressive than noise. Conversations had evaporated. The clatter of plates, the scrape of cutlery gone. All that remained was the dull thud of hearts beating too fast, too afraid. The boy retreated to the kitchen, head bowed, invisible now. Elena busied herself with tasks that required no purpose, her hands moving quickly just to avoid being still. Every worker carried the same tension, shoulders, hunched breaths measured. Harlan sat rigid at his place, his hand closed into a fist, nails pressing against his palm until pain sharpened the edge of restraint. He wanted to speak, to break the spell of fear that Dawson had cast. Yet he held back. The moment demanded patience, though patience cost him dearly. The room felt darker, though the lights had not changed. The weight pressing down was not shadow, but submission. Dawson had won for now. Later, in a voice low enough to escape notice, Elena leaned close and whispered. She spoke not of herself, but of someone who had stood before her. Janet. A manager who once defended the staff, who made sure each worker was treated as more than labor. She carried warmth into the room like a lantern, reminding them the job had dignity. But Dawson had called her weak. Headquarters agreed. A signature on cold paper was all it took. Her years erased her presence, reduced to absence. No farewell, no gratitude, just removal. No one mentioned her now. Her name hung dangerous in the air, a ghost best left unspoken. The silence around her memory was louder than Dawson's shouts, a silence born of fear and survival. For Elena, remembering felt like treason. For Harlan, it was revelation. The diner had not collapsed overnight. It had been stripped piece by piece, beginning with those who cared. Elena lowered her voice as if the story itself was forbidden. There had been a woman in the kitchen, older, steady, loyal. 7 years she had stood over the ovens, keeping recipes alive, correcting mistakes without cruelty. Her hands had fed generations of regulars, her patience had trained the young. She had given more to the diner than it could ever repay. One day she asked a question. The tips had thinned the jars, suspiciously light. Her words were quiet, almost respectful, but Dawson answered with fury. Accusation became dismissal. A stroke of his pen, and her name was erased. No hearing, no chance, no dignity. She left in tears, apron still dusted with flour, carrying nothing but shame. The staff remained silent, eyes fixed on the floor. No one dared speak for her, not even in whispers. Her absence became another scar, a wound that never healed. Another name surfaced, though barely worth remembering to Dawson. A boy, no more than 18, fresh from school, awkward in his uniform. It was his first week. His hands were clumsy, his confidence thin. One night he burned a roll, just one blackened edges curling in the pan. Dawson's rage ignited. The shout tore through the kitchen, a storm aimed at a child. Each word cracked louder, crueler, until the boy's face broke. He shook, unable to steady himself, eyes wide with humiliation he would never forget. He tore off his apron and dropped it to the floor. The door slammed behind him, heavy and final. Outside, his sobs were muffled by the night sealed away by the walls that had driven him out. The role he ruined was nothing. The damage Dawson dealt was everything. And another young life walked away from work with fear instead of pride. Elena recounted these moments in a tone drained of inflection, like someone reading from a ledger of grief. Her words moved evenly, each sentence flat, as though any rise in pitch might draw Dawson's attention. She explained what it meant now to work here. No one challenged orders. No one questioned missing wages. Voices stayed low movements, careful. Survival required obedience, and obedience meant silence. The weight of it filled the room like a soaked blanket pressing down on everyone inside. Customers felt it without naming it. Workers carried it until it bent their backs. Even laughter when it came was thin and nervous, gone in an instant. Harlan listened, stone still. Every detail fell into place, forming a picture he could no longer ignore. This was not misfortune, not a bad season. It was wrought, systemic, deliberate, unchecked. His chest felt heavy as iron, and the silence itself became an accusation. From the kitchen came another figure younger than Harlan had imagined. Marcus's eyes were red, their corners etched with smoke and sleepless nights. His skin carried the gray tone of someone who lived too close to the ovens, every pore saturated with heat. His apron, damp with sweat and stained with grease, hung heavy against him. His hands, told the rest, cracked at the knuckles, calloused over years of labor, streaked with flour that clung stubbornly to his skin. They were hands that worked past their limit, hands that did not rest. He moved quickly, but not with ease. Each step carried the anxious energy of a man chased by deadlines he could never meet. His gaze flickered toward Dawson before settling on the stove, as though the wrong glance could cost him more than pride. Marcus did not speak. He did not need to. His body declared its own testimony, a man ground down by the very place that should have been his refuge. Later, in a brief moment when Dawson's voice retreated, Marcus spoke. Not loudly, not with bitterness, but with the weary resignation of someone who had no choice. He had 3 children. One, sickly, always in need of medicine that cost more than his pay. Another, older, facing school fees that climbed higher each month. The youngest still asked for bedtime stories, waiting each night for a father who was never there. Marcus confessed he worked double shifts, not for ambition, but for survival. When his body gave in, he slept in the storeroom, folded into a corner with bags of flour for pillows. He said it plainly, almost as though it were normal. Yet the truth lay bare. His life was devoured by obligation. Every detail tightened the knot in Harlan's chest. This was not merely a worker stretched thin. This was a father shackled to desperation, laboring not for dreams, but for the right to keep his family afloat. Harlan watched Marcus's hands as they moved across the counter. The scars, the swelling, the relentless repetition, each mark struck him with memory. He saw himself decades younger in the early days when survival meant working until his skin split. He remembered nights spent awake, palms raw, fighting for something that seemed fragile but possible. The difference was unbearable. Harlan had once carried faith afire that pushed him forward. Marcus carried only fear, pressed down by a manager's cruelty and a system that bled him dry. Where Harlan had believed, Marcus simply endured. The recognition twisted inside him. It was like seeing his reflection warped in a broken mirror, familiar yet tragic. The man before him was not lazy, not careless, but trapped in a machine that punished loyalty. For the first time in years, Harlan felt more than guilt. He felt kinship painful and undeniable, and it left him shaken, unable to look away. Halfway through the shift, Elena was gone. No clatter of cups, no hurried footsteps, just absence. Harlan noticed at first the gap where she should have been. He rose without a word, tracing the faint trail she left behind. A pale light bled from the storeroom, thin as a knife's edge through the cracked door. He paused, every instinct warning him to stop, yet he listened. A muffled sound reached him, faint and trembling sobs pressed hard into silence. He did not enter. He stood, rooted, the shadows around him heavy, the air colder than before. His hand hovered over the doorframe, fingers curling, then loosening. What he was about to hear was not meant for him, but he knew he could not turn away. Something waited beyond that sliver of light, something that would not let him forget. Through the crack he saw her crouched low with a phone pressed to her ear. Her body folded inward, arms wrapped tight as though she could shield herself from everything closing in. Her words spilled out in whispers, fragile and uneven. "I'll bring a roll home. Don't worry. I promise." She repeated it, a vow stitched together from nothing but love. Her voice cracked on the last word, breaking under weight it could not carry. Her hand trembled around the phone knuckles, white nails biting into her palm. The darkness seemed to swallow her whole, dimming the weak light that slipped across the floor. She was not an employee then, not a server, just a mother trying to hold her world together with nothing but promises. Harlan felt the truth settle deep in him. It wasn't about tips or schedules anymore. It was survival, stripped bare. Harlan's body shifted forward. His lips parted, words forming before he could stop them. He wanted to announce himself, to break the illusion of anonymity and offer something more than pity. His tongue caught on his name, ready to be spoken. Then he froze. The urge collided with restraint. He drew in a breath, sharp and heavy, and swallowed it whole. His hands dropped to his sides. He took a step back instead of forward. It wasn't fear. It was timing. The revelation would come, but not now. Not like this, when her vulnerability was naked and raw. To intrude would be to wound her further. He turned away, shoulders rigid, carrying the secret still. Behind him, her whispered promises echoed, cutting deeper than any accusation. Harlan knew the moment would haunt him, yet he chose silence because silence for now was mercy. The diner held only a scatter of customers' half-finished meals spread across tables. Dawson slipped out from the kitchen, scanning the room with restless eyes. His gaze darted left, then right, measuring every movement. When no one looked his way, his mouth curled into a thin, crooked smile. He drifted toward table 4, where a family had just left. Crumpled bills lay beside an empty plate, ordinary and unnoticed. But Dawson's hand lowered quickly, practiced, confident. With a flick of his wrist, the money disappeared, pressed flat against his palm. He straightened eyes, sweeping the room again, but no one reacted. The theft was quiet, efficient, almost rehearsed. He moved as though nothing had happened, as though the tip had never existed. For anyone watching closely, it was not clumsiness. It was precision. This was no mistake of the moment. It was habit-cold, deliberate theft masquerading as routine. Dawson slid the bills into his pocket, smooth and untroubled. His shoulders never twitched, his pace never changed. He walked on as if carrying nothing but authority, not stolen wages. The customers noticed nothing. Their attention stayed buried in plates and conversations, blind to the exchange. But Elena saw. She froze, mid-step, eyes fixed on the pocket now bulging with what should have been hers. Her mouth opened as if to speak, then shut again. The air caught in her throat, the words strangled before birth. Her eyes dimmed, heavy with recognition. She had seen this before. She would see it again. And each time the silence tightened around her neck, a noose she could not loosen. The truth was undeniable, the theft undeniable, yet no one moved. Dawson walked away, untouched, arrogance stitched into every step. Elena's silence was not choice. It was survival. Harlan saw it all. His hands trembled against the counter, shaking with a fury that felt volcanic. His knuckles turned pale, skin stretched tight over bone. The air around him seemed to thicken, every breath sharper, heavier. The cinnamon roll in front of him mocked him now, a cheap emblem of what had once been sacred. Once it had stood for love, care, community. Now it was nothing but a corpse of sugar, a reminder of all that had been corrupted. His chest clenched. The restraint he had carried so carefully began to crack. Every insult he had endured, the hollow smiles, the broken workers, the stolen tips, pressed inward, squeezing until something gave. And in that moment it did. A seam tore open inside him, silent but absolute. Harlan no longer wondered whether to act. The decision had already been made, buried in the tremor of his hands and the blaze in his eyes. The dam was breaking. The chair scraped against the floor, a dry crack that cut through the diner's hush. Every head turned. Harlan pushed back with a steady force, the movement carrying more weight than any shout. His hand lifted to his face. The glasses came off, folded neatly, placed on the counter beside the uneaten roll. His jacket followed, shrugged from his shoulders, and dropped across the stool. What remained was not disguise, but presence. His back straightened, his chest rose. He stood tall in a room that had been bent under another man's rule. In that instant, the weary traveler disappeared. The stranger vanished. The authority of decades buried in silence emerged raw and undeniable. Every line of his frame spoke not of defeat, but of command. He was no longer a guest in this place. He was the one who had built it. The air shifted, waiting. The moment had arrived. His voice carried no haste, no tremor, only the weight of finality. "My name," he began each word. "Deliberate is Harlan West." The diner froze. Forks hung midair. Conversations died in half-syllables. And then the words that shattered the silence: "I own this place." The sound landed like thunder inside a sealed room. Elena's tray slipped from her hands. Glass burst across the tiles, shattering the paralysis into sharp fragments. She stared, mouth-parted, eyes wide with recognition that bordered on disbelief. The customers leaned forward, hunger no longer for food, but revelation. The mask was gone, and in its place stood the man who had built the empire they thought forgotten. The words themselves were simple, but spoken here at this moment, they were fire. Nothing in the room would remain the same. Dawson's face drained of color, the bravado leaking from him in real time. His lips twitched. His voice stumbled, broken syllables spilling out with no shape or meaning. He clutched at his pocket as if the money inside could shield him. His hands fumbled awkward, clumsy, nothing like the tyrant who barked orders minutes before. His eyes darted wildly, seeking a foothold, but found none. Each glance only betrayed his fear. The staff watched. The customers watched. And in their eyes, he shrank. The man who had swaggered across the room, who wielded humiliation like a weapon, now looked small, cornered, exposed, trembling under the weight of truth. Harlan didn't need to move closer. The balance had already shifted. The diner, once suffocated by Dawson's voice, was now filled with his silence, and that silence stripped him bare, reducing him from tyrant to coward in a single breath. Harlan raised his hand, finger steady, pointing straight at Dawson. His voice carried no rage now, only judgment, sharp and final. First he said, "You steal from your staff. Tips meant for them end up in your pocket." The words landed heavy, undeniable. Second, you grind your people down. You strip their dignity, cut their hours, and call it efficiency. You break them to feed yourself. Third, you destroy the name this diner was built on. Every corner of this room shows your neglect. Every customer who walks out sees your failure. Each sentence struck like a hammer echoing off the walls. Dawson flinched at every blow, shrinking further beneath the weight of exposure. Harlan did not raise his voice, yet each word reverberated, filling the space with clarity. It was not accusation anymore. It was a verdict. Then came the sentence. "You're fired. Effective immediately." The room locked in silence. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then a ripple of relief broke through, customers exchanging glances, workers lowering their shoulders as though chains had fallen. Elena covered her face, her hands trembling, a sob cracking loose from somewhere deep inside. Not despair, but release. Marcus lifted his head from the grill, eyes catching light for the first time in months. Hope, fragile but unmistakable, flared across his face. The words had been simple, just 3 syllables and an order. Yet in that moment they carried more force than any shout, more finality than any law. Dawson's reign was finished. Dawson's mouth opened, but no authority remained. "This isn't fair." He stammered the words, thin, desperate, unconvincing. His legs betrayed him as he staggered backward, each step less steady than the last. His protests scraped against the air, but no one listened. No one cared. The audience he once ruled now turned away. His face sagged pale and drained, the swagger gone. All that remained was a man, undone, clinging to nothing. He retreated into the kitchen, the place that had been his stage of cruelty. The door swung shut behind him with a dull finality, sealing him away like a figure erased from memory. The diner stayed still, but the silence had changed. It was no longer suffocating. It was cleansing. The tyrant was gone, swallowed not by shadow, but by justice. The diner froze in the wake of the storm. Customers sat unmoving, forks idle on untouched plates. Chairs did not scrape, voices did not rise. It was as if the building itself held its breath. Elena's eyes shone with unshed tears, her hands pressed tight against her mouth. Marcus placed a hand against his chest, drawing in one long, unsteady breath as if testing what freedom might feel like. And Harlan stood still at the center, his gaze sweeping across them all. His eyes had hardened, no longer clouded by disguise or hesitation. He saw every face, every weight they carried, every fracture left behind by Dawson's rule. The silence was not empty. It was charged, weighting heavy with expectation. The tyrant had fallen, but the question lingered: what came next? Harlan knew all of them were watching him for the answer. Harlan's voice broke the stillness, firm but steady. He did not shout. He declared, "Wages go up 20% for everyone effective next week." A pause, then. "Tips belong to those who earn them. No one touches them but you." Eyes lifted from the floor. The air shifted. "We will hire more staff. No one here will be forced into double shifts against their will. Those days are finished." Each line was simple, precise, unmistakable. Promises not wrapped in slogans but delivered as commands. For the first time, the silence did not feel suffocating. It cracked, letting hope filter in. Customers exchanged approving nods, workers straightened their backs. The change did not wait for tomorrow, it had begun already. The empire had nearly rotted to dust, but here in this room, renewal sparked. Harlan turned to Elena. Her eyes widened, her body rigid as though expecting reprimand. Instead, his words softened. "You will help me choose the new manager." The sentence hung in the air, impossible at first to grasp. Elena blinked, one hand pressing to her chest as if to steady her heart. The tears she had fought spilled over, trailing down her cheeks unchecked. Her lips parted, no argument, only disbelief. Then, in a trembling whisper, she answered, "Yes." The word cracked, breaking into sobs she could no longer contain. They were not the tears of defeat, but of release, of finally being seen. Harlan did not smile. He only nodded, the weight of his trust laid gently upon her shoulders. It was not pity. It was recognition. And in that moment, Elena ceased to be invisible. She had become essential. Harlan spoke his name with intention, then added words that cut deeper than any reprimand ever had. "Your pay rises higher. 30%, and health insurance for your children." Marcus froze. His body seemed unable to process it. He had heard empty promises before, but never this. His mouth parted, yet no sound emerged. For a moment he only stared, searching for the lie. None came. The weight of disbelief cracked, and tears rushed down before he could stop them. Hot, unashamed tears sliding across soot-stained skin. He lifted his head at last, shoulders trembling. For years he had bent under burden, waiting for collapse. Now he stood taller, if only by an inch. The gift was not charity, it was rescue. And for the first time in years, Marcus let himself believe in tomorrow. On the counter sat the forgotten cinnamon roll, hardened at the edges, glaze dulled to wax. Harlan picked it up, feeling its weight heavier than pastry should be. He bit into it. The texture was stiff, the flavor muted, almost bitter. Yet somewhere beneath the blandness lingered a hint of sweetness, faint but present, like an echo of what once was. He chewed slowly, eyes lowered, and gave the slightest nod. Not approval, not satisfaction, acknowledgement. The roll was imperfect, broken even, but still capable of promise. In that small, fragile taste he found what mattered, the possibility of return, of rebuilding. The cinnamon roll was no longer failure. It was a symbol waiting to be redeemed. A sweet roll should taste like home, not bitterness. The diner held its silence. Eyes brightened one by one. Elena brushed away her tears. Marcus managed a faint, trembling smile. No cheer rose, no applause followed. Yet something unspoken shifted. The room that had carried fear now carried the first trace of hope. A new chapter had begun.